What happened while we were away, brought to you by, finally, some indictments. As the statute of limitations closes for former FBI Director James Comey and any perjury he may have engaged in his testimony to Congress about the origins of the Russiagate hoax, it's being reported by some outlets he could be facing an indictment in the coming days. The extent of the potential charges is unclear, as well as which part of his testimony could be subjected to perjury charges. The Department of Homeland Security has revised their death toll from yesterday's attack at the ICE field office in Dallas, Texas. One victim is dead with 2 injured. Joshua Yan is the suspected shooter who then killed himself. Details are still matriculating in about his background and what motivated him. At a stop in North Carolina yesterday, Vice President JD Vance laid the blame at people like California Governor Gavin Newsom, who has this entire year, and especially in recent days, demonized immigration and customs enforcement officers.
The very people who keep us safe ought to be honored and protected and praised by Democrats and Republicans alike. It is time to stop the rhetorical assault on law enforcement. Because here's what happens. Because here's what happens when Democrats like Gavin Newsom did say that these people are part of an authoritarian government. When the left-wing media lies about what they're doing, when they lie about who they're arresting, when they lie about the actual job of law enforcement, what they're doing is encouraging crazy people to go and commit violence. You don't have to agree with my immigration policies. You don't have to agree with Donald Trump's immigration policies. But if your political rhetoric encourages violence against our law enforcement, you can go straight to hell, and you have no place in the political conversation of the United States of America.
Senator Rick Scott is among sponsors of the Chloe Cole Act in Congress, which would ban meatball surgery and chemical castration for minors in the name of gender. The legislation is named after well-known detransitioner and anti-trans activist Chloe Cole. A Republican proposal in the House would mint $400,000 in $1 coins with the visage of Charlie Kirk on them. Moving on, a new paper published at the journal Sex and Sexualities from the American Sociological Association seems to be a camel's nose under the tent at academizing pedophilia. Reported on by the Manhattan Institute's Colin Wright, the paper laments that most scholarship, quote, marginalizes childhood sexual pleasure and views children as vulnerable subjects. They argue that we must, quote, interrogate dominant narratives of sexual innocence that suppress young people's desires and instead recognize how children, quote, negotiate pleasure and meaning amid intersecting hierarchies of age, race, gender, and class, end quote. Paper is written by researchers Divya Bana and Stefan Luke. And finally, are you ready to spontaneously combust? I know I almost did after watching this. Here's reporter Bess Byers at Reason.com.
Why is one man facing 5 years in prison for not wearing a mask in 2025? And just for reference, you'll get less prison time for scamming $500,000 in COVID benefits. And the prosecutor in this whole debacle is exactly the kind of guy you'd expect. Let's talk about it. Washington State lifted its COVID state of emergency in 2022, and a year later, the Department of Health lifted its mask mandate. But in the 2024 election, Island County Auditor Sheila Kreider imposed her own mask mandate. Apparently that summer, almost half her staff got COVID, and since they're all over 65, she couldn't afford to have that happen again. She also had concerns about fentanyl-laced ballots, which makes sense because I'm sure that's a key voting bloc in Washington. Even though the county auditor doesn't have the authority to impose their own mask mandate, hers only applied to the ballot counting room, and observers who didn't want to wear one could watch from the hall. But Tim Hazlow didn't want to watch from the hall. He's the former chair of the county's Republican Party, a Navy veteran, and outspoken opponent of mask mandates. So Hazlow refused to mask up or leave the ballot counting room. Apparently somebody called him an asshole. He responded, "I know who you are." And then they called the cops. So much for police reform. Initially, prosecutor Greg Banks only charged Hazlow in district court with a single misdemeanor count of disorderly conduct. But since Hazlow didn't want to accept the so-called exit ramps given to him, Banks upped the charges to include a felony in Superior Court. And surely it wasn't a personal vendetta with the self-proclaimed husband and father's history of posts calling conservatives Nazis, Trump an asshole, and so many Americans gullible and stupid. Real neutral guy. Anyway, charges filed included unauthorized access to a voting center, which is a felony, disorderly conduct, and criminal trespass in the first degree. Banks also filed charges against Tracy Abel, the 61-year-old former vice chair of the Republican Party, who didn't wear a mask either. So the case went to trial, where jurors found Hazlow guilty of misdemeanor criminal trespass and unauthorized access, which is a Class C felony and the same magnitude of criminal offense as someone trying to lure a minor for predatory purposes. He's now facing 5 years in prison, and that felony means losing his voting rights, his gun rights, and possibly his job. His civil suit also got dismissed because the judge said the county auditor does have the authority to manage things in her office, which apparently includes mask mandates. Hazelow's new attorney, Angus Lee, said during the trial the jury asked for a copy of Washington's laws, and the court didn't provide them. There's also video footage of other people in the ballot counting room without masks who, for whatever reason, didn't get slapped with a felony. Now they plan to appeal all the way to the Supreme Court. Update: since filming this video, Tim Hazelow has been sentenced to 40 hours of community service. He also must pay $200 in court costs, a $500 fine, and submit a DNA sample to the state. Because of the felony conviction, he was forced to surrender his firearms, and he lost his security clearance, which cost him his job. Thanks, Greg Banks. So why are we ruining lives over masks that don't work?
And that's what happened while we were away.